It's 5 to 7. He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone. It's 5 to 7.
Well, hello again. Welcome to Islands at War, another Islands at War special, book special, just in time for Christmas. I'm Keith Bengelly, no Nick again today, but I have in the studio with me Steve Foote, publisher and owner of Blue Ormer Publishing, and also Steve is Chief Executive Officer of the Priaulx Library, Guernsey's local studies library. So, welcome, Steve. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me, Keith.
No, not at all. So, listeners will know that Nick and I delve into local newspapers, but certainly we also mine information from local memoirs and from local diaries throughout the occupation period here in the Channel Islands. And so my first question to you, Steve, really, I suppose, is what is the difference between a diary and a set of memoirs?
Well, that's an excellent question. Yeah, so both diaries and memoirs are really valuable sources for anyone who's studying any particular period of history. You know, there's the diary of Samuel Pepys, from the diary of Anne Frank. There's all sorts of things that you can find out from diaries that you can't find from anywhere else. So it really gives you an invaluable insight as to how ordinary people experienced historic events. And a lot of the time they may not even have known that these things were going on around them or the significance of them at the time. The important thing in a diary is people are just recording what they did, what they heard, what they saw, what they experienced on a day-to-day basis. Some diaries aren't that interesting because it just said I got up at 5 o'clock and, it was raining and that's about all you get. But there are a number of exceptions, and these are the sort of ones that I've kind of picked on today to share some of my insights in that I've got.
I think we also is one thing for the listener to know just at this point. Steve is going to talk about diaries and memoirs that span the whole of the occupation period, whereas Nick and I are so far up to September 1941 in the occupation. So Steve will be mentioning diarists that we haven't yet brought on stream, but that's not going to spoil anything. Yeah, so Steve, what's your first one you're going to kick off with?
The first one I was going to kick off with is the diary of the Reverend Ord. So the original diaries only came to light in the 90s. Reverend Ord was the Methodist minister. He was at what was then Brock Road Chapel in Guernsey in St Peter Port. It's what we remember as Ebenezer and has recently been converted into apartments. The interesting thing about Reverend Ord, he didn't have a huge circle of friends in Guernsey. He'd only just arrived in the island just before the war. But in the First World War, he'd been a prisoner of war and had become fluent in German and also spoke a fair bit of Russian as well. And as a result of that, he got to know a number of German officers who were stationed in Guernsey, and the diaries talk a lot about the discussions and and how he got to know them. The originals of the diary are in the Priaulx Library. They were deposited by the family in the Priaulx Library, and John Nettles came across them while he was researching his book, Jules and Jackboots, and said, these really deserve a wider audience, and so that they were edited by him, and published in 2021. It really is fascinating. He was a very literate guy. He was, he did come into contact with a lot of people in the course of his work, and like I said, he did come into contact with a number of German officers. I'm going to read a couple of excerpts to illustrate, from each of these diaries to illustrate what I'm talking about and give you an idea. But the two Germans he got to know particularly well were a guy called Heinrich Boedicke and Reinhold Zachmann. The first mention of Boedicke in the diary is on the 4th of March 1942, and he said, "Last night, young German minister Heinrich Boedicke came again. for the joy of being in a home and talking about the things near his heart and mind, the studies and books from which he is forcibly cut off, to hear him quietly but decisively expressing his views against the Nazi regime and giving his first-hand personal experience of the dragooning of the German churches by Hitler's satellites was a moving experience. So, and then a few pages later, a couple of months later, I'm talking about towards the end of April, he brings a friend of his, Reinhold Zachman, who's in the same unit, and he introduces him as a very honest man and a fine comrade. Both are bitterly hostile to their government, and they beg to be allowed to sit and listen to the German transmission from London. And these relationships, so that's starting in 1942. These relationships continue all the way through the rest of the war while they're in the island, and they exchange information. When the radio sets are confiscated, they share news, what Reverend Ord has heard through his Guernsey network, and what the Germans have heard through theirs.
Yes, I mean there should be no feeling at all that Ord was collaborating with Germans. These are Germans that were prepared to talk to Ord on Ord's own terms. They knew that they were talking quite often out of turn.
Oh, very much so. Yeah, they were expressing their views against the Nazi regime. They were fervent and disagreed with what their leadership were doing.
Yes, it's just one of the things that we are very careful to emphasise is that any long conversations with German officers are by no means collaborative. Many of the officers over here were vehemently against the Nazi regime, and Ord was able to talk to them, I suppose, being a clergyman and also being fluent in German. So that gives us not only for our programme, but also validates a lot of it gives us this difference between rumour and fact, which is very, very important. And of course, the Germans themselves were prone to being fed lots of propaganda. And as you say, once the BBC were unable to broadcast, as it were, to local people, to people in the Channel Islands, once the wireless sets have been confiscated, it feels there's a lot more fact filling that vacuum. But the German officers were able to listen to the BBC themselves, weren't they?
Yeah, I think, yes, they were, yeah.
Yes, yeah.
So, well, and also a lot of islanders covertly continued listening to the radios.
Yeah, but of course it's the dissemination of that information. If it got into the wrong ears or the wrong hands, it could lead to people being imprisoned.
Well, I was going to come on to that, because we're going to look at one of the underground news networks that grew up out of that. But before we do that, I was just going to read another passage from the Ord diary, which, again, I think one of the things which fascinates me is that, particularly at this stage of the war in 1942, people were absolutely desperate for news, and particularly after the radio sets were confiscated. And what is really, well, not surprising knowing what we know now, but the Guernsey grapevine really sprang into its own. When people were starved of information through official sources, the word of mouth and the rate at which rumours spread, and whether they were true or not, or whether some of them were exaggerated in the telling, the word got around surprisingly efficiently. One great example of this, and this is with Reverend
What's
Ord.
the date of this entry?
So this one's August 1942.
Yep.
And it's got a familiar character, someone who Reverend Ord knew well, but also was my great-great-uncle. So I thought it would be it'd be a good one to share.
Why not?
It's a nice little anecdote. He said, so fresh manoeuvres were in progress this morning. At noon, as I came home, I was held up in a crowd of about 40 people at Ivy Gates, so just about 100 yards from his home, within as many yards of our gates. The reason was that General Muller, who's the head of the German forces in the island, was due to pass up to town in a fine borrowed car after inspecting troops somewhere to the west. He looked fat and well-fed. His face was so red that he might have had a coughing fit, or more likely a spasm of yelling himself hoarse, as these gentlemen frequently do. Just beside me, a voice spoke out quite loudly. The voice of old nonagenarian Dr. Foote, the veterinary surgeon, who had come up in his car. He wanted to know why the road was blocked. I explained with difficulty, as he was very hard of hearing. Then, to the amusement of all, he asked me, with an armed German sentry close by, Well, what's the latest news you have to tell me? This raised a huge laugh from the civilians, and indeed it was quite hard to put the old man off.
Yeah, so Dr. Foote, he spun into my family's orbit during the war. You and I were discussing this last week. Well, I just wanted confirmation that it was the same Dr. Foote. Just before the evacuation, the vets over here were engaged in a lot of euthanizing pets and things. And there's in one of our family diaries, it says on the 21st of June 1940, today poor Nellie was killed, and I'd never heard of a Nellie before, but it became apparent later on when my grandmother wrote that Dr. Foote had put Nellie to sleep, so she'd had her dog put down, and of course, so tragically, Gran never evacuated, so poor Nellie went west needlessly.
It's a very sad situation. Not uncommon. Winifred Harvey, in her diary, which we're going to look at later, it did exactly the same thing. She had her dog put down by Dr. Foote in anticipation of evacuating, and then decided not to go.
Yeah, of course, we did get to the position at the end of the occupation where it was remarked on by some of the members of the liberating force that they didn't see any cats or dogs because they'd either locked up inside or mainly been eaten.
Yeah.
Okay, so anything else to say about Ord, or you certainly recommend it?
Yeah, definitely. And I'm going to come back to Ord on a little bit later. But while we're on the subject of news and how effectively the news got out, I couldn't pass up the opportunity of talking about Frank Fuller. Mm-hmm. Now, Frank didn't leave a diary during the occupation, but he did write his memoirs in the 60s. But we'll come on to that. So this is very much a retrospective. But Frank Fuller was a journalist. He worked for one of the newspapers in the island, and the memoir that he wrote certainly covers his experience of the occupation until 1944, and we'll come back to why that was. But it was a memoir, not a diary. But the thing is, that, the great thing about this is that Frank was a journalist. He was a really good writer, and if you look at some of the passages that...
What's the title of this one, Steve?
This one's called The Silent War.
Yep.
And it's about his experience as a journalist at a time when they were subject to heavy German censorship. But I'm reading the passage. You covered. We heard the song at the opening of the show about the raid on the White Rock. This is his passage where he talks about suddenly at 5 minutes to 7, the drone of approaching aircraft was heard. In seconds, the peaceful summer evening became a horrible nightmare. 6 enemy aircraft came, it seemed, from nowhere. He goes on, we had no defence. The tide was low and the crowds rushed for the only shelter available underneath the pier. This certainly saved hundreds of lives, but others were not so lucky. Some tried to shelter under their vehicles only to be crushed as the fires started and the vans and the trucks collapsed. The blood of the wounded and the dying mingled with the juice of the tomatoes. And when I came on the scene, just as the last Hun plane faded into the distance, the sight was one I shall never forget. Mm. That's, a really poignant, way of getting...
Yeah, and that's the difference between a journalist observing and writing about something than a civilian recording in a diary or later on in a memoir. So that journalistic eye, yeah. I think you've got quite a bit to say about Fuller.
Well, I do, yes. There's another thing, and like I said, he was under heavy German censorship. They were strictly controlled everything that was published in the press, but some things they were forced to publish, propaganda. And anything that they did want to write, he describes the whole process where they were asked to tone things down or write things in different ways. There's a whole chapter about his dislike of the German censor, Goettman. But I'll just read the opening of his chapter where he talks about the censorship. To produce a newspaper subject to wartime censorship is difficult enough, but to have the enemy as your censor is 10 times worse. Add to that the fact that you cannot explain to the public why you were allowed to print this but not that, or that the papers were out late because the German censor was being particularly difficult that day and you have a trying situation to say the least. When the Nazi propaganda poured out of the censor's office as sausages from a machine, how could one hope to counteract or at least minimise it in the eyes of local loyal islanders? King Canute would have been quite as powerless to stem the flow of Nazi news during the occupation of Guernsey as he was to halt the tide. he said, I had no option but to agree with Gutmann and his military predecessors that the German war communiques, news items and Lord Hawhor's daily outpouring should be given due prominence, the front page, nothing less. This I did with my tongue firmly in my cheek, and the front page was duly filled with Nazi-supplied news. We thus schooled our own public into accepting the front page as nothing but Nazi propaganda in which we had no hand, and turned their full attention to pages 2, 3 and 4 as exclusively ours in which we featured local news, official notices and civilian affairs. So, they did find ways to get around the thing. There's but the censor came in for a particularly bad criticism.
On a wider issue with Frank Fuller, he didn't see the war out in Guernsey, did he?
No, he didn't. So, as well as during the day writing articles for the newspaper, he was also part of the Guns network, the Guernsey Underground News Service. And what he did was listen to the BBC News on a hidden radio set that he had at home. He typed it up into a summary of what the BBC News had said, and these were then printed off in news sheets which were circulated around the island, including the Priaulx Library, which used to have a news sheet and concealed so that people could come in and read. And that ran from 1942, after the radios were confiscated, right through to the middle of 1944, when there was a collaborator betrayed the network to the Germans, and all the ringleaders were rounded up, arrested and deported to Germany. Frank describes in here how he was deported to Germany. I think it was the day before D-Day. So if he hadn't have made that crossing, he wouldn't have ended up in a German prison and being liberated by the Americans in 1945.
Yeah, so this is not just a memoir of his activities in Guernsey during the occupation. It also then follows him into throughout being, I suppose, how would you put it, betrayed.
Yeah,
and then his journey to experiences in captivity in Germany and his subsequent liberation, as you say, by American forces.
Yes, and he was on the verge of death. He was in a really bad shape when he was liberated, and some of his Guns colleagues weren't as fortunate and died in German captivity. So when Frank returned after the war, and this, the second half of this book focuses on he campaigned for compensation for those who'd been persecuted by the Germans, and his campaign, the publication of the Silent War was part of his campaign to for justice for those who'd been so poorly treated by the Americans for what was effectively a resistance activity. They weren't blowing things up, but undermining morale by sharing what actual news was a powerful underminer of morale.
And did he go back to work as a journalist once he came back?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, so that's Frank Fuller and Silent War. You may refer to it later on, but certainly recommended. We're listening to Islands at War here on Gnet Radio. Gnet Radio sponsored by Guernsey Arts. Keith Bengelli here with you. It's the second of our book specials. First episode was with local historian Tim Osborne. Now we have with us Steve Foote, who is publisher and owner of Blue Ormer Publishing, and in a minute you'll explain what an Ormer is. Steve is also Chief Executive Officer of the Priaulx Library, Guernsey's local studies library. Once you've explained what an Ormer is, we're going to have another book.
Yes, just to cover that one off, an Ormer is a type of shellfish which is unique to the Channel Islands. Its closest relative is known as the abalone, which is in the Asia-Pacific region.
And they're not necessarily blue. Anyway, there you go. No. So, next book, Steve.
Right, so the next one is another one which is more of a memoir than what actually started off as an official history, called Guernsey Under German Rule by Ralph Durand. So it was at the beginning of the war, the librarian of the Priaulx Library was a guy called Ralph Durand. He'd already been a successful author, as amongst many other things, which we'll come back to. But he was the librarian of the Priaulx Library, and the bailiff asked him to keep an account of the war as it progressed. So it wasn't a diary, it wasn't a memoir, it was actually, it's intended to be the official history. The bailiff arranged for him to have full access to all the controlling committee files, and as the war progressed, and he wrote an account as the war was actually happening.
When was this decision made to keep this running record of the war? Was it? It must have been early on.
Yeah, it's 1940. It was, and it was announced in the newspapers, and that Ralph was going to be the official historian.
So it predates the occupation.
No.
So as soon as Guernsey was occupied, the bailiff, with quite some forethought, really, the bailiff is the head of our judiciary, and effectively, in the absence certainly of the Queen's or the King's representative, he would have been our leader in the war. So some great foresight by, it was Bailiff Carey.
That's right, Victor.
Yeah.
So Ralph Durand was an interesting character. He joined the Priaulx Library as librarian during the 1920s, but before then he was born in Reading to a Guernsey family. His father was a clergyman, but he decided that he didn't want to go into the church and set off on his travels to gain world experience to become a writer. And he travelled to Australia and then Africa, found himself fighting in the Boer War. He then settled back in London, got married, and started produced several award-winning novels. Then the First World War broke out, and he joined up there, ended up being an officer, and actually ended the war working in the intelligence service in Italy. He published a couple of novels about his World War I experience as well. So returning to Guernsey, he was already a well-established novelist, but became the librarian at the Priaulx Library, and from the 1920s, and actually served right the way through the occupation. Because he hadn't been born in Guernsey, he faced deportation and had to make a strong case of why he shouldn't be amongst the 2,000 people who were deported.
Was his daughter did you have an invalid daughter?
That's right, yeah.
Invalid wife or invalid daughter?
Both.
Yeah. That's right.
Yeah. And so but like I said, there was this link to the Guns network, and the library was one of the places that people could come to read the Guns news sheets and find out what was going on. They were also, he's actually quite careful during the book. It's sort of, there are a few, it's written as a history, but in some cases he references things that happened in the library as though he's sort of not, in the third person, talking about the librarian of the Priaulx Library as though it's someone else. And so I thought this is a particularly good passage to illustrate that. Let me just find the thing. So the sort of censorship again that the Germans tried to exercise. He talks about one day. He doesn't have dates. It's not done in the same way. But he's talking about the experience of living with the Germans. So here we go. As a step towards our conversion to Nazism, librarians and booksellers were ordered to surrender for confiscation books by certain authors and all books of an anti-German character. At the Priaulx Library, which was visited by an armed party under an officer, the librarian, with a view to getting rid of his visitors as quickly as possible, pretended to be eager to comply with the order, surrendered 2 novels by H.G. Wells, worth second-hand about a shilling each, expressed regret that he had nothing else to offer, and suggested that, as Heine was a Jew, a set of his works, which would have been easily replaceable, should be confiscated. The officer, who seemed never to have heard of the famous German poet, refused the offer and withdrew his party. The librarian then spent a busy hour removing and hiding to a hiding place all books that would have been confiscated if the officer had carried out his orders more intelligently.
Okay, so very sympathetic.
Yeah. But it's like we were talking about before. There are elements of all of that. I think the thing which the common thread running through all of this is that as you get into the later stages of the diary in 1944, particularly after D-Day, when all the food supply lines have been cut off, that the focus is almost exclusively on the shortage of food and the fact that that's happening. And you see that in just about every writer of any of the diaries in the time. And, it's exactly what you would expect. It's like the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If your basic needs are not being met, that becomes your major focus. If you haven't got a roof over your head and food on your plate, then that is going to be your major focus. So there's a particularly poignant piece here when it talked about the arrival of the Vega. And this wasn't the first arrival, but the Vega, the Red Cross ship, which came bringing food supplies to islanders when they were nearly starving.
Yeah, because the Vega made its first visit the tail end of December 1944, so it was towards the end of the war. But of course, people didn't know it was towards the end of the war.
Yeah. So he talks about the Vega bringing food parcels, and then he says, once again, it was possible to spread butter and jam on something more suitable than a boiled potato. The temptation to indulge imprudently was too great for one person at least. With his afternoon tea that day, he ate 2 thick slices of bread and butter, 2 thick slices of bread and jam, and a captain's biscuit lavishly spread with butter. Such indulgence seriously depleted his stock of butter and jam, and as if fate wished to punish him for his greed, the last meal that he ate before parcels were again distributed consisted of the tough outside leaves of broccoli, minced, stewed, and enriched with so-called calf's foot jelly made by boiling down hides. But the orgy was worth the cost. Normally he rose from a meal feeling that he would gladly sit down at once to another. But the lavish meal that he ate so improvidently gave him a blessed sense of repletion such he had not seen for many months.
Yes, but Durand, he did see out the war, but I think he not too long afterwards he passed away.
That's right. There's in the second edition of this book, there's an introduction which talks a bit about the story behind the book. But he did finish the book. It was ready for publication in October. So, which is why I think it's not really a memoir. He was writing it as it went along.
Contemporary events, yeah. So this is October 1945.
Exactly. And at first, the main reason why it couldn't get printed is because all the printers were, it's finding it difficult to get paper and ink and all the rest of it, and B, they were being dominated by demands for all the official printing business of the States. So there are correspondence on file where Ralph Durand is writing to the head of the States, Louis Guillemette, saying, can you get this up the priority list? I'd like to get my book out, and being told, no, everything we're doing is really top priority. And then I think shortly after that, there was Air Commodore Brock, who was a Guernseyman in London during the war, that visited and had met up with Ralph Durand to look at what he could do to help. And he took over seeing the book through finding a printer. He found a printer, and unfortunately in December 1945, Ralph Durand died. And this was the long-term effects of the malnutrition that he'd had during the war.
Yes, malnutrition and privation. Yeah. And how old was he then? He was sort of like if he fought in a Boer War. But a tremendous addition to wartime, memories, diaries, and accounts. Yeah.
But Henry Brock, the Commodore Henry Le Marchant Brock, who was one of the founders of the Guernsey Society, took it upon himself to get all the book finished. He found a printer in Essex. He went through the final stages of proofreading, and the book came out in the spring of 1946, which still made it the first official account of the occupation.
So not printed on the island, but printed in the UK. Good. Okay. Well, that's a strong addition to the recommendations. That's, what's it called, Steve? Again,
that one's called Guernsey Under German Rule by Ralph Durand.
Okay. And Durand is spelled
Durand.
Yeah. Okay. Right. And your next recommendation.
Right. So the next, I'm going to take two together. One of, but there were a number of different motivations and circumstances where people kept diaries. I think we talked about, Ralph Durand, who was asked by the bailiff to keep a record. We talked about Reverend Ord, who was just writing, everything that he was picking up as he went along. And Frank Fuller, who was a journalist, who was writing was in his blood. I'm next going to talk about two diaries, which diaries of women who had, at the time, they were both fairly let's say, aristocratic women, so who had servants and large houses, so they were able to, gave them more time that they could spend writing, quite extensive diaries, and have come down to us and been published recently. So one is Ruth Ozanne, and the other one I'm going to talk about is Winifred Harvey. So Ruth Ozanne was the daughter of a former bailiff, Sir Edward Chetmore Ozanne, and she wrote an extensive diary. It was published a few years ago by Amberley Press. And I was going to pick out, just as an illustration, I mean, the thing is that people who were, who had the means to live, living in town like they were, they would have had gardens, they would have been able to grow their own food and vegetables. But also, being in the middle of town, they were ripe for having their buildings requisitioned by the Germans, because they were single people living with houses much bigger than they needed, was in a central area, was going to be, they were prime targets for being requisitioned. So it brings out a different aspect of the impact it had on people's everyday lives. I'm going to talk about two episodes here. One from Ruth Ozanne's diary. She was able to stay in her house for the duration of the war, but 94-year-old Uncle Willie, who lived in Sumray Street, was living in Sumray Street in 1942 when the Germans requisitioned the whole street. It's, as for those of you who know the geography of St. Peter Port, Sumray Street is right in the centre. It comes out opposite Elizabeth College. It's right next to the Royal Courts, where the States offices were, in all of the, central downtown area. And, in October 1942, Ruth records in her diary, "I was rung up by Miss Abrams to say that Uncle Willie must be out of his house by the following Monday, taking everything except his linoleum and the blackout curtains. It was a ghastly shock, and I went round to see what arrangements could be made. It was decided that Uncle Willie would go with Miss Abrams and live at Mrs. Le Pedvin's, Friesland, in the Vale."
Right, now this is where I declare an interest, because this is my house.
Yeah, that's where we're sitting now.
And Mrs. Le Pedvin was Rachel Le Pedvin. By then, her husband, Alfred John Le Pedvin, who worked in the very room that we are in at the moment. He was a tomato grower. He died in 1942. And Miss Abrams is Nurse Abrams.
Ah.
And the house was being used as a sort of a hospice residential home. And it saved it from being requisitioned by Germans. There were Germans billeted next door and all along this road, because I've said before there was vast military stables along this road. So Uncle Willie, until we prove otherwise, saw out his days.
Yeah, well,
may well have expired in the room we're going to have supper in later on.
Exactly.
That's a nice thought.
Yeah.
But
the follow up to that. So it was agreed he was going to come and live here, but a few days later, and said Ruth obviously helped move him out of there. And she recorded in her diary, again, worked hard all day at number 29 Sumray Street, and the same on Sunday. At 3 p.m, the ambulance came to take Uncle Willie off to the Vale. He went away on a stretcher with a little knot of friends to see him off, waving his hand and saying, "This is more amusing than a funeral."
Yes, and he had been rector, I think, of St. Martin's Parish.
Yes.
And again, our family from St. Martin's, the Majors and the Marcorns and the Wallaces all knew Uncle Willie back in the day. And I think he's actually got an extended interest for you because of another Guernsey book.
Well,
but we'll go into that another time. So
yeah.
Uncle Willie will feature again at some point in another episode.
Yeah. But sadly he didn't see the war out. But, he did, he died at the age of 96, 2 years later. So, and did have his funeral in St. Martin's Church, and he's buried in the churchyard there with his wife and daughter.
Yeah. So, well, thank you for referencing the place where we're recording from. That's a lovely bit of local history. Okay.
So the other one, so that's the diary of Life in Occupied Guernsey, which is the diary of Ruth Ozanne, published by Amberley. So I'm not just covering books that I've published.
No, just that. Yeah.
But they're all available in the Priaulx Library.
Yep.
The other diary I said I was going to talk about is called The Battle of Newlands by Winifred Harvey. Now, this one is Winifred Harvey again was a fairly wealthy single woman living in a house called Newlands at the top of Prince Albert Road. It was unfortunately situated from, as far as she's concerned, because it was not very far from the government house, which had been requisitioned by the Germans, a number of very fine-looking houses on Mount Durand, at the top of Mount Durand, which also had all been requisitioned by the Germans. So, unfortunately, she was asked to move out of there. They did actually give her a week to think about it and plan it, which is quite unusual. But there's a fairly lengthy passage where it describes the whole process of them persuading her to move out. She found somewhere in the Grange, but managed to negotiate with them that she could, because she was passionate about her garden, that she managed to keep access to her garden, which meant that not only was she able to maintain the garden during throughout the occupation, but also she was able to grow her own fruit and vegetables to feed herself. There's a new edition of this book coming out. It was published in the 1990s, but there's a new edition in the pipeline for next year as part of the 80th anniversary of liberation. One of the other, and I won't go through the whole details of Winifred Harvey's book, but one of the other things which is an interesting perspective, which I hadn't really thought about, is that she describes a holiday that she had in Sark during the occupation. It wasn't completely straightforward, but people were allowed to go on travels.
Yes, Nick and I have covered that off, and we found it quite astounding that, in theory, you could sort of leave Guernsey and go on holiday, albeit just across the water to Sark. But and she actually did that then.
Yes, she said there was a lot to do before we started. Emergency ration cards to obtain, notice of absence to give at the constable's office, and a permit required to travel from the Kommandantur, which would have been at the Grange Lodge Hotel. So, she talks about they managed to get away. This was in 1942. They spent a week there. Well, they'd intended to spend a week there, but then they were prevented from coming back because there was obviously something going on, some military operations. But they stayed. Their stay was slightly longer than intended, but they did eventually make it back.
So when's this book going to be republished then?
Next spring.
Okay, spring of 2025. So and that will be a Blue Ormer book?
Yeah.
Oh, excellent, because that one can be picked up second-hand here on the island, but if anyone's thinking about that, they might just as well hold off and pick up a new copy in the next few months. Okay, so that's great. What have we got next?
Right, so the next up, all of the ones that we talked about so far, people who were sort of living their ordinary lives in Guernsey during the occupation, some of them doing remarkable things like Frank Follard, but none of them were really at the centre of what was going on in government, in liaison with the occupying forces, and actually the real story of what was going on. There's two diaries which have come out over the last few years, which give us a very interesting insight into that. One is the diary of Baron von Alfsess. It's called Gentle Violence. Again, another one, a collaboration with John Nettles that he and I worked on to get translated from the original German and get it. It was published earlier this year.
It had been published some time ago.
Well, I will come on to that.
Yeah, please. Yeah, sorry.
But yes, but it was published while the Baron was still alive, and he essentially rewrote it before it was translated into English during the 1980s. So for this version, we went back to the original diary that he wrote, which has a number of important differences compared to the sanitised version, which came out in the 80s.
Yeah, because he was a German aristocrat. I can't remember. Was he Prussian? He was certainly the aristocratic class in Germany.
Yeah, he was an aristocrat. He was a Baron von und zu Alfsess. He had a Schloss, which had been in the family since the 14th century. He was a lawyer by profession, and he'd joined the Nazi Party in the 30s when basically everyone was told, if you don't join the Nazi Party, you won't be able to progress in your career. And he explores this, his beliefs in in fact, he expounds on lots of theory and philosophy, and the thing is part of his diary, which I was going to come on to a bit later. But yes, I think he felt that the aristocracy in Germany agreed with some of the aims of the Nazis, but disagreed with the ways that they were going about
the methods.
it.
Yeah.
And this is where the title "Gentle Violence" comes from. It's he feels that they're going about it in far too much of a brutal way. But it is very interesting, and because it is the only account that we've got of anyone on the German side who was involved in, at any level of seniority and what the discussions were going on. We know a lot about all of the tensions there were in during the occupation on the Guernsey side and on the British side, but there's very little apart from this as a source for what the discussions that were actually going on the other side of the fence. The other one we're going to look at, and because I think it's interesting to contrast the two.
So you will be returning to the
yes, I'll come back to that.
Yeah.
But the other account that we've got, and again the only one which is really looking at what it was like from the Guernsey authorities' point of view, was Louis Guilmet's diary. Now Louis was the secretary to the controlling committee, so not only was he in all of the meetings of the controlling committee and making sure that the minutes got out on time, but he was also the go-between between the Feldkommandantur, which was the German civil affairs unit, and the controlling committee. So
he was a liaison between the two bodies, and
Yeah.
he was a senior civil servant.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in a lot of the situations that are covered in their diaries, that both the Baron and Louis were in the same meeting. So you get the two different sides
they
of the
complement
same
one
coin.
another.
Yeah. Well, or not.
Yeah.
So
Can we just spell it's Guillemette, and it's worth spelling for people when they seek the book out.
yeah. So it's called The People's Messenger, The Occupation Diary of Louis Guilmette, Guillemette.
Yeah, another very well written diary and quite comprehensive.
Yeah.
What's the period Louis Guillemette's diary start? I think we were looking at that.
So-
Kicks in about 1943.
So Louis Guilmette's diary starts in the middle of 1942, and Baron von Alfsess was started off in Jersey. He had responsibility over both islands. So he first, the Guernsey authorities would have been aware of him because he would have been regularly travelling here. But it wasn't until sort of late 1944, early 45, that he fell out with the high command of the German authorities, and they sent him off to Guernsey to get him out the way. But Von Alfsess's diary starts in 1943, and Guilmette's diary starts in middle of 1942.
Yeah, so Van Alpes is 43, but starts in Jersey, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And then he, as you say, he's sent over to Guernsey. Guillemette's diary, just remind me, does it cover the first deportations in 42?
It does, yeah, and that's where the
a
Baron.
very good account, I think, as well.
That's where the Baron first crops up. So
Yeah.
I'll just read you,
Please.
if I can find it. Here it is. So this is this is the second wave of deportations, which happened in 1943.
So just the background, these are people that were not born on Guernsey, they were British people, or Guernsey people that were born off island. We covered this in our recent episode, that Hitler had determined that these people, in retaliation for German nationals in Iran being deported from Iran, Hitler responded by wanting people sent away from the Channel Islands. It was parked by local officers over here, local German officers, but Hitler found out, and of course he ensured that this took place. So the first deportation was in 1942, then there was a second round in 1943. So this is where Guillemette and Van Alpes sort of
first cross swords.
Butt heads, so to speak.
Well, yeah, actually, so what was different with the second round is that it went a bit further than the first, and the half of the members of the controlling committee received letters asking them to present themselves for a medical prior to potential deportation. It said, I telephoned the bailiff and told him I'd go immediately to Grange Lodge and ask for an explanation. This I did, and having first seen Inspector Zachau regarding the arrangements, I went on to Baron von Alfsess and asked him why the bailiff had received this letter. So it goes on, and there are other people that he cites, examples who've received this. And so eventually this culminated in a meeting with Mr. Leal, Mr. Sherwell, so Ambrose Sherwell, Dr. Simons, and Louis Guilmette went to Grange Lodge and had quite a friendly chat with Baron von Aufsess on this subject. It may sound strange to say that the conversation was friendly when it must affect adversely so many of our people, but we know what the public does not, and that is that the Feldkommandantur are the only friends we possess, and the talk was mainly an assurance for the Baron that he would do his utmost on our behalf. And I know that he will.
Yes, Grange Lodge is a hotel which was the headquarters of the German military.
It was the Feldkommandantur was the civil affairs unit. So they were a bunch of uniformed but
bureaucrats.
Effectively civil servants,
yes,
but in uniform. And they were the interface between the military and the local government.
Okay, so the Grange Lodge is still a hotel, and people can stay there, and it's got an illustrious history throughout the occupation. And it's interesting that some of the people that you mentioned there, we've mentioned in our episodes. One, Dr. Simmons was the health officer over here, and I could see Nick and I uncovered some things recently, and you can see why the Germans would have wanted to send him away to a detention camp in Germany. But the very thought that the Germans were trying to deport our head of a head of state, if you like, was really quite extraordinary. And that was something that Nick and I will cover when we get eventually to 1943. But
sorry about any spoilers here for the but the and as we've talked about in some of these other diaries, as the situation got more and more severe, particularly after D-Day, when the Germans were unable to import any food from the continent, and obviously the island was unable to be self-sufficient in growing enough to feed all the hungry islanders and the German forces, the much more drastic measures started to be considered. The British were effectively negotiating with the Germans, saying we're not going to send in Red Cross ships. This was like sort of around August time. We're not going to send in Red Cross ships because you'll just take all the food for yourselves. And if you can't feed the islanders, then you should surrender. That's the only honourable thing to do. You can't comply with your international legislation about taking care of the occupied people, and so just surrender. The Germans were pushing back and saying not then. So there was obviously discussions going on around how they should respond to this. I think a US Navy ship was sent to the island to offer them the opportunity to surrender. But we get this little insight in Aufsess's diary that I haven't seen anywhere else. And he talks about one of his colleagues, Heine, turns up and handed me a legal opinion from a young lawyer who had heard my speech. In his opinion, so this isn't Aufsess's opinion, this is the young lawyer, the civil population should now, after a short ultimatum to England, be condemned to starvation. They should simply be transferred to camps where they would no longer receive any kind of sustenance at all. The legal justification was that a state of emergency and its accompanying risk existed. It was an absolutely shocking document, completely one-sided and composed with a kind of rage for which we Germans are hated all over the world. It was completely out of order. So, but, the fact that it was being given serious consideration amongst the German forces makes you realise that, if the Red Cross ships hadn't have come in, what the kind of situation, and it was not like the Germans hadn't done this elsewhere. They had done exactly this in Russia.
Yes, and of course Churchill had his reservations about the Red Cross coming here, and the two bailiffs actually wrote to the Red Cross, I think, didn't they?
That was what started the whole ball rolling.
Yeah. They must have conferred, obviously. Wrote to I can't remember, Red Cross in Geneva.
It was the International Red Cross in Geneva. Actually, they weren't allowed to confer, and you can tell. You find this from the Guilmette diary, where he talks about the bailiff of Guernsey was asking for permission to phone the bailiff of Jersey to discuss what. In the end, they both drafted their own messages, and they were both sent independently, so they didn't see each other's appeals.
Because towards the end of the war, the Germans, in Berlin, But they sent Hofmeier, didn't they, to the island, who was a rabid Nazi. And I think there's quite some, in the Van Alphen's diaries, it's quite illuminating about his relationship with Hofmeier, and I think Hofmeier's sort of right-hand man, Zimmerman or something. And I've yet to immerse myself in the final stages myself. But it takes us right through, Van Alphen takes us right through to the end of the occupation, and his experiences, I think, in captivity in the UK.
That's right. Yeah. He'd because he spent nearly 3 years as a prisoner of war in an English prisoner of war camp, being going through denazification.
Yes,
which is another whole. I'm sure you could do another whole episode on that. But the other thing about that is that in 1945, the Baron's wife, Marilise, was, after the assassination attempt on Hitler, was overheard to have said, it's a shame they didn't succeed. And she was imprisoned, and so that would have been in 1945. The Baron didn't discover whether she'd survived that experience until he was released from prison of war camp in 1947.
Yes, I mean, the denazification was quite interesting. I mean, I think all of the officers in the Channel Islands had to undergo denazification and were sentenced accordingly as to what transpired. I think the real hard cases ended up in Canada, but I'm not really sure. Hofmeier was an interesting chap, and we'll get to him in due course in Nick and I's monthly episodes. But so both of these highly recommended, especially.
I've got one more bit.
Oh
on
yes,
the,
by all means. Yep.
Because I think the thing which is interesting is because you can compare and contrast between the two, because they were in the same meetings. So I read you the passage about about Louis Guilmet's first impressions of the Baron. Baron von Alsace took quite a different attitude to. He saw Louis as a well. I'll read the passage.
Yes, please.
So he was the first mention in the diary is on 13th of December in Baron von Alsace's diary. So Louis Guilmet records that the Baron came to meet the bailiff, and the bailiff requested that Louis be there too. It was to inform them that the Vega was on its way, but had been delayed because of a tempest. Louis said that he also told the bailiff that he would be the first to welcome the representatives of the Red Cross, since the shipment is for us and not for the Germans. So they were obviously keen to make sure that they were sending out the right message. But the Baron doesn't mention this meeting in his diary. But on the 28th of December, the day that the actual Vega actually arrived.
This is 1944.
Yep. He says, the official introduction of the Red Cross Committee to the Bailiff of Guernsey. It comes as no surprise when the little Judenclerk, Guilmet, shows up and elbows his way in. He has no manners at all and is intelligent and cheeky. and of course, Judenclerk is what is in the German diary. It means Jewish clerk. It's in the context a very derogatory expression, which is explained in many footnotes. And then when 2 days later, when the Vega actually departed, the Baron writes, the insolent and dangerous Judenclerk Guilmet has come to attend the farewell in the closed-off section of the harbour after all, and only because I kept watching him like a hawk was he prevented from passing on some documents to the Red Cross Committee directly. If you look at the cover of Louis Guilmet's diary, that's exactly what he's doing. He's in front of the Vega with a bundle of papers that he's and looking quite sheepish.
Well, we'll be tweeting them. The book covers out later on. Yeah.
It does have a happy ending though, because the final reference on the 4th of May 1945, Baron von Alsace writes, I have long since made my peace in a good way with Secretary Guilmet. He is a diligent, intelligent man with a hidden disposition of a petty bourgeois and a curiosity with which he seeks to expand his small Guernsey horizon. So it was a happy ending.
Well, it brings into mind Bob Dylan's words, well, you don't have to be a weatherman to see which way the wind blows. So I think the Baron there was already preparing his defence. But both of those books are excellent on the final stages of the war. And as you say, you can compare and contrast, and probably should both be brought together. Okay, well, we're in the last couple of minutes. How can people get hold of the books? You've got a website?
Yes, yeah. The not all of these are available on the website,
no.
But the People's Messenger, Louis Guillemette, Max von Alcest, Gentle Violence, Douglas Ord, the Guernsey Occupation Diaries are all available, and Frank Farr's The Silent War are all available from blueormer.gg. That you can also find Guernsey Under German Rule, the second edition there. The first edition came out in 1946, and if it is somewhat hard to find these days.
I found one the other day in my bookcase.
It's also written on very thin paper in very small type and very floppy covers. So the new edition is an easier read.
Yeah, well, thanks for coming in. That's tremendous. And apart from just the usual fantastic detail and information about the occupation of our islands from 1940 to 1945, they're very good reads. They're not just reference books. You can get completely immersed in them. And so it just remains for me to thank you for coming in.
Well, thank you.
I'm sure we'll hear from you again. And journey through all aspects of the occupation of the Channel Islands. So you've been listening to myself, Keith, and Nick will be back shortly. And thank you to Steve again. And we'll go out with a little bit of Jim Delbridge and 5 to 7. Just to say that if you have any inquiries about this episode or anything else, you can get hold of Nick and I on occupied@gnetradio.com. So thank you very much, and cue Jim. Bye-bye. And Steve?
Bye.
Bye. Yep.
He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone. It's 5 to 7. All his friends and family had gone, left on a ship 'cause they knew what was to come.